Three farmers on that road borrowed more money than their fathers had ever seen, and for a while it looked like they were the smart ones. They had newer machines, cleaner fields, faster harvests, and they finished weeks ahead of everyone else. But 7 years later, two of them were gone, and the third one stood in a gravel yard watching his combine get sold for less than a third of what he paid, and about 30 yards behind him, there was an older man standing. Quiet hands in his jacket, not saying a word because he had already seen this ending coming long before anyone else did. The auctioneer called the number again, and it sounded smaller the second time, like it had lost something on the way out into the cold air. Nobody rushed to bid. Boots shifted on gravel. A few heads tilted like men were doing the math in real time, but nobody looked excited, not the way they did when that machine first showed up years ago. Walter Hale stood at the back like he always did, not part of it, not avoiding it, either just watching because he believed if you paid attention long enough, things would show you the truth. And right now the truth was simple. That machine was never really the problem. The man who owned it, Henry Dobbs, stood off to the side, not broken, but not steady either, just watching something leave that he once believed would carry him forward. And that part Walter understood because he had been offered the same road more than once. He could still hear clear as day a salesman leaning on his fence, talking easy, telling him you're leaving money in the field with that old tractor you're running behind. You're making this harder than it needs to be. You could be done faster, cleaner. You could get ahead. Walter had listened. He always listened, but he never rushed. And when the talking was done, he had asked one thing plain and simple: what happens if the price drops? The salesman smiled like they always did, like that question didn't matter, like things always even out over time. But Walter didn't think in straight lines like that. He thought in seasons, the kind that come in stretches, the kind where you don't get a reset. Just because the numbers say you should back at the auction, the number moved again, not much, just enough to keep it alive. And Walter watched the machine instead of the people, because that was where the truth usually showed up, not in what people said, but in what remained after they were done saying it. He remembered the spring that combine came in. He remembered how it looked sitting clean in the yard, sun hitting the paint like it meant something, and he remembered the feeling across that whole stretch of land like things were changing, like the old way was falling behind. And he remembered driving home after seeing it, walking into his own barn where his tractor sat older than most of the men, buying new equipment that year, paint-worn metal showing in places that had been handled too many times. And he remembered standing there for a minute, not starting it, not fixing anything, just looking at it and thinking about what it meant to keep going with something that didn't impress anybody anymore. There were years after that where it felt like he had made the wrong call, and he knew it, the kind of feeling that builds slowly every time someone else finishes before you, every time a storm rolls in, and you're still halfway through a field every time something breaks, and you're the one lying on your back in the dirt trying to get it moving again, while somewhere down the road a newer machine keeps running without stopping. Those years were not easy, and he didn't pretend they were. There were nights he sat at the kitchen table with coffee gone cold, running numbers that didn't feel right. There were mornings when the engine took 1 second too long to turn over, and he stood there thinking this might be the day it doesn't start. And there were moments when he could feel people watching, not judging, just noticing you still running. The thing they would say, and he always answered the same way: it still runs. What he didn't say was how much it took to keep it that way. The hours, the small fixes, the choice to wait one more season, the decision to live a little tighter so he didn't have to carry something that wouldn't let go. When things turned back at the auction, the bidding slowed again, and this time it felt like the end people had seen enough. They knew where it was going. The auctioneer pushed once more, then dropped it, and the sound carried clean and final across the yard. Sold. Henry didn't move right away, just stood there for a second like he was letting it settle. Then he turned and walked toward the house, slow, steady, not looking back. And nobody stopped him. Nobody had anything to say that would change what had already happened. Walter watched him for a moment, then looked back at the combine one last time. And what he felt wasn't pride or relief. It was something quieter, because this was never about being right. It was about still being there when things stopped going the way people expected. He turned and walked back toward his truck, same pace he always kept, not fast, not slow, just steady. The way he worked his fields, the way he made his decisions, one season at a time. And as he reached the door, he paused just a second, looking out across the flat land beyond a yard, thinking about how different things looked 7 years ago, when everyone thought they knew what the future would reward. Some chase speed, some chase scale, some chase the idea that bigger meant safer. Walter had chased something else. Not fast and not bigger, just something he could carry all the way through when things didn't go right, and standing there in the cold with the auction already moving on, it was clear in a way nobody could argue with anymore. He was still there, and that was about to matter more than anyone had expected. 7 years earlier, that same road looked different, not in the dirt, not in the fences, but in the way men talked and the way they carried themselves. There was a kind of forward lean to everything, like people believed if they just pushed a little harder, a little faster, they could get ahead and stay. Their trucks were newer, paint was brighter, and there was always something being delivered somewhere down the line, a planter one week, a tractor the next. And when harvest came, the machines ran later into the night lights moving across the fields like something out of a different time, and Walter saw all of it, because you could not farm that stretch of land without seeing what the man across the road was doing. And for a while, what he saw made sense on paper, made sense in the way numbers can line up. When everything goes right, Henry Dobbs was one of the first to make the move. He had good ground, not the best, but steady, and he worked it right, never cut corners, never rushed things that mattered. And when he brought that combine in the yard, filled up with neighbors the way it always does, when something new shows up, people walked around it, ran their hand along the panels, looked into the cab, talked about hours and capacity and how much ground you could cover in a day with something like that. And Henry stood there a little straighter than usual, not showing off, just believing he had made the step he needed to make to stay in the game a couple miles down the road. The Miller brothers went in together on a full package, new tractor, new planter, new combine, everything matched, everything clean. They talked about efficiency, about timing, about not losing a day when the weather turned. And when they spoke, it sounded like they had already moved into a different class of farming, not bigger yet, but headed there and fast. Walter heard all of it, not because he was looking for it, but because that is how things travel in a place like that. You hear it at the co-op, you hear it leaning on a truck bed. You hear it in short conversations that start with weather and end with numbers, and everywhere the message was the same: things were changing, and if you did not change with them, you're going to fall behind. And for a while, Walter did feel behind. There was no point pretending otherwise. The first harvest after those machines came, and he watched lights moving across fields long after he had shut down for the night. He would finish a section the next morning and see that someone else had already covered twice as much ground the day before, and there's a kind of quiet pressure in that, not loud, not spoken, but they're all the same, because farming has always been part work and part watching what the next man is doing and measuring yourself against it, whether you admit it or not. There were days he could feel it more than others when the sky turned, and he knew he would not finish before the rain came, when he had to stop because a belt slipped or a line cracked, and he stood there losing time while someone else kept moving. And it would cross his mind, then maybe they were right, maybe this is what it takes now, maybe holding on to what you know is not the same as doing what is right. But thoughts like that did not last long with Walter, not because he forced them away, but because he always came back to the same place. He did not measure things by a single day or even a single season. He measured them by whether he could carry them through when things did not line up the way they were supposed to. One evening late in that first year, he sat at his kitchen table long after supper. His wife had gone to bed, and the house was quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the wind pressing against the windows. He had a piece of paper in front of him, nothing official, just numbers he had written down over time: cost of fuel, repairs, seed, chemicals, property tax, the usual things, the things that come whether the year is good or bad. And off to the side, he had written another set of numbers, the ones the salesman had shown him: payments, interest, projected savings, yield, increases. It all looked clean the way it always did when it was written out neat and straight. But he sat there a long time looking at both sets, and what he saw was not just the difference between them, but the weight of them. One set moved with the year, the other did not. One could bend, the other stayed fixed. And he knew himself well enough to know which one he could live with. He folded the paper, set it aside, and that was the end of that decision, at least for him. But the road did not slow down for that choice. The next couple of seasons, the gap felt wider. The Miller brothers finished earlier. Every year their rows tight, and even their timing sharp. They missed fewer weather windows. They lost less to delay. And when prices held even halfway decent, it looked like the whole thing was working exactly the way it was supposed to. Henry ran hard, 2 longer days, tighter schedules, pushing to make the most of what he had taken on, and there was nothing lazy about any of it. Those men worked harder than most. They had to, because once you step into something like that, you do not get to ease into it. You have to meet it every day, whether you feel like it or not. Walter saw that and respected it even when he did not follow it. There were mornings he passed their fields, and saw them already running before the sun was fully up at night when he drove by, and saw lights still moving when he had been shut down for hours. And he knew what that minute meant. They were chasing something that did not wait. And that part was true speed. Does matter, timing matters, getting your crop in before the weather turns matters. And for a while that edge showed in the numbers, not just in how things looked, but in what they produced. And there were conversations at the co-op that leaned in that direction, numbers tossed around, comparisons made not in a mean way, just the way men talk when they're trying to figure out what works and where they stand. And Walter would stand there, listening, hands in his pockets, nodding when it made sense, not arguing, not defending, just taking it in, because he never believed one season told the whole story, and he had seen enough years to know that things do not move in a straight line forever. What he did not say out loud was that he was keeping track not just of what those machines could do, but of what they required to keep doing it, because that was the part people did not talk about much, not in those early years when everything still felt like it was paying off the payments that came due, the pressure to keep running no matter what, the margin for error getting thinner, even if the top line looked better, and none of that showed up in the shine of a new machine or the speed of a clean pass across a field, but it was there underneath, building slowly the way pressure does when it has nowhere to go. Walter went about his seasons the same way. He always had, not because he could not change, but because he had chosen not to. He planted when the ground was ready, not when the calendar said he should. He fixed what broke when it broke. He worked longer on some days than he would have liked and shorter on others when there was nothing to be gained by pushing, and he accepted that there were times he would be behind, that he would watch someone else finish first, that he would miss a window by a day or two and take the loss that came with it. Because for him, the measure was not whether he was first, it was whether he could keep going without something waiting on him at the end of the season that he could not set aside. And year by year, that choice did not look impressive, but it held. And while others were building speed, he was building something else, something quieter, something that did not show up in a single harvest, but started to take shape if you looked long enough and were willing to wait. And most men are not wired to wait when things are going well. They are wired to push harder, to take the next step, to move with the moment. And for a time, that is exactly what that road did. And if you had stood there in those years and asked who was getting ahead, most people would not have pointed at Walter Hale. They would have pointed at the men running newer machines, covering more ground, finishing sooner. Because that is what progress looks like when everything is still lining up and nothing has pushed back yet. By the third year, the difference between those two ways of working had settled into something you could feel without anyone saying it out loud. The road still looked the same, but the pace had changed, and it showed in small things, the way trucks came and went more often at some places, the way certain fields got worked twice as fast as others, the way conversations at the co-op leaned a little more toward numbers than weather. And Walter noticed all of it, not because he was trying to compare himself, but because you cannot help but notice when you are part of something that is shifting around you. And for a while, it still looked like the faster way was the better way. Henry was covering more ground than he ever had. The Miller brothers had tightened everything up to the point where they could move from one field to the next without losing a day. And when the weather gave them a window, they used all of it, engines running long hours, lights cutting across the dark, like they were trying to hold onto something that might slip if they slowed down even a little. And maybe they were right about that part, because farming has always been about catching the right moment and making the most of it. And there is no question that newer machines help you do that. Walter saw it every time he had to stop and fix something that did not want to wait for a better time. There were days when he lost hours to a problem that would not have existed on something newer, days when he watched clouds building in the distance, knowing he was not going to finish before the rain came, and he could feel that pressure, not in a loud way, but in that steady, quiet way that sits with you while you work and follows you home when the day is done. There was one stretch late that season where it all seemed to stack up. At once a belt went on him in the middle of a field, not a big thing on its own, but it happened at the wrong time, and wrong time matters more than the problem itself. He spent most of that afternoon in the dirt, working at loose hands cut up a little from metal that had seen too many years, and by the time he got moving again, the light was already starting to go, and he knew he would be back out there early the next morning, trying to catch up, knowing full well he would not quite get there. And the next day, he drove past Henry's place on the way out and saw him already running the combine, moving clean across a field that looked like it would be done before noon. And Walter did not feel envy exactly, but he did feel the gap between them, and he carried that with him the rest of the day, not as regret, but as something he had to accept as Part of the choice he had made that night. He came in later than usual. His wife had kept supper warm, and they ate without much talking, not because anything was wrong, but because that is how it goes when a day takes more out of you than you expected. And after he finished, he went back out to the bar, not because he had to, but because he wanted to make sure everything would be ready in the morning. He worked through a couple of small things, tightened what needed. Tightening, checked what could wait. And while he was there, he stood for a moment looking at that old machine again the same way he had years before, and there was no question it was costing him time. There was no question that newer equipment would have made that day easier, maybe even changed the outcome of it. But he also knew something else, just as clearly, that the cost of that ease did not end with the purchase. It followed you. It sat there waiting for you, whether the season went your way or not. And that was the part he never lost sight of. Even on days when it would have been easier to forget it, the next morning came clear and cold, and he was out before the sun had fully come up. The engine turned slower than he liked for a second, then caught and settled into a sound he trusted. And he moved back into the field, picking up where he left off, not trying to rush, not trying to make up everything at once, just working steady, because that was the only way he knew to do it. And as the days went on, that pattern repeated itself. There were good days where everything held together and he made up a little ground. And there were days where something slowed him down and he gave it back, and over time it balanced out, not perfectly, not evenly, but enough that he kept moving forward one season into the next, while across the road and down the line the pace stayed high. Henry and the Millers were not slowing down. If anything, they were pushing harder, because once you build something that depends on that kind of output, you have to keep feeding it. You cannot step back without feeling it right away, and that showed in the way they worked, in the way they talked, shorter conversations, more focus on getting to the next thing, less time to stand and lean and watch the weather roll in, because watching does not move a machine, and there's a certain kind of effort in that, not just physical, but mental, the kind that does not turn off when you go inside, because there is always something waiting on the other side of the next day. And Walter saw it in small ways. Henry missing a morning at the co-op that he used to make time for the Miller brothers, cutting a conversation short because they had to get back before the ground changed, and none of that was wrong. It was just different. It was the cost of running faster. And for a while, it still looked like the right call. The numbers held. Prices were not bad, not great, but good enough that the system kept working. And if you looked at it from the outside, you would have said they were doing exactly what they needed to do to stay ahead. Walter heard that more than once, not directed at him, but close enough to land. You cannot keep doing it the old way forever. Things are different now. And he never argued with that, because in some ways it was true. Things had changed. The tools were better. The pace was higher. The margins for getting it right in a single pass had improved. But what had not changed was what happened when things did not go the way you planned, and that part had a way of showing up when you least wanted it to. Later that season, the weather turned in a way nobody had counted on. Not a disaster, just enough to make timing harder. A stretch of days that did not line up with what the crop needed. And for the first time in a while, you could see the strain, not openly, not in a way anyone would point to, but in the way machines ran a little longer, the way people checked forecasts more often, the way a missed window felt like it mattered more than it should. And Walter felt it too. He was not outside of it, but he moved through it the same way he moved through everything else, one piece a day. Time, not trying to solve the whole season in a single day, and that different, small as it seemed, began to matter in ways that were not obvious at first, not something you could measure in a week or even a month, but something that started to build underneath everything else. And while others were still running faster, still covering more ground, still looking like they were ahead, Walter was building something quieter, something that did not show in a single pass or a single number, but was there all the same, growing in the space between what he owed and what he could control. And by the end of that third year, if you stood back far enough and looked not just at the speed, but at the shape of things, you could see the beginnings of shift, not in who was finishing first, not in who had the better equipment, but in who could carry what they had built into whatever came next. And most people were not looking for that yet, because nothing had forced them to. Until something does, most folks keep going the way that seems to be working, because that is what makes sense at the time, and for a while longer it still did. By the fourth year, things didn't break all at once. They just stopped lining up the way they had before. And at first it was small enough that most people didn't call it problem. Prices slipped a little, not enough to panic, but enough to tighten things that used to feel loose. Fuel edged up. Parts cost more than they did the year before, and seed didn't come any cheaper either. And when you stacked it all together, it didn't look like a crisis. It just looked like Less room, less space for things to go wrong without being felt. And that is where the difference between those two ways of farming started to show, not in one big moment, but in 100 small ones that added up over time. Henry felt at first not because he was weaker, but because he was carrying more. He was still running the same pace, still putting in the same long days. But now every decision had a second layer under it, not just what needed to be done in the field, but what needed to be covered at the end of the month, and that changes. The way a man works, whether he wants it to or not, there were days he pushed harder than he should have, not because he misjudged the field, but because he couldn't afford not to, and there were nights he stayed out longer than he used to because stopping early didn't feel like an option anymore. The Miller brothers felt it too, though. They didn't say much about it. They tightened everything up, even more: fewer breaks, quicker turnarounds, less margin for delay. And from the outside, it still looked efficient, maybe even more so than before. But if you watch close, you could see the difference in the way they moved: a little less easy, a little more driven, like they were not just keeping up, but holding something back from slipping away. Walter saw all of it the same way. He always did, not looking for signs, not trying to read into things, but noticing what stayed consistent and what changed. And for him, not much had changed. His costs were still his costs, the same things he had been dealing with year after year. And when prices dipped, he felt it, of course. He did. There is no such thing as being outside of that. But the difference was in what followed the dip for him. It meant adjusting where he could, waiting where it made sense, stretching things a little thinner for a while for the others. It meant something else. It meant the numbers that had once worked cleanly now had to be pushed harder to keep working, and pushing something that is already tight has a way of showing up sooner or later. There was a stretch that season where the rain came at the wrong time. Not heavy, not destructive, just enough to slow things down. And in a normal year, it would have been an inconvenience, a delay, nothing more. But this time it landed different because timing had already been tight. And when you're running that close to the edge of delay, does not just cost you time, it costs you position. Walter lost days the same as everyone else. He sat in the bar more than he liked listening to weather reports that did not change much, waiting for ground that would not take a tire without giving something back. But he didn't feel the same urgency to force it. He waited because he could, and when the ground finally came around, he went back to work, picking up where he left off, not ahead, not behind, just continuing. And that was enough for him. Henry didn't have that same room. He tried to move sooner than he should have, and for a while it worked. He covered ground, he kept pace, but then something small turned into something bigger, a breakdown that came at the wrong time apart, that took longer to get than it should have, a delay that stacked on top of the days already lost. And suddenly the schedule he had been holding together started to slip. And when it slips in that kind of system, it doesn't settle. It keeps moving in the wrong direction. The Miller brothers hit it next. Not the same problem, but the same kind of pressure. A missed window. A field that didn't come in the way they expected. Yields that were just a little under what they needed, and none of it was enough on its own to cause real damage. But together, it started to shift the balance. And that balance was what everything depended on. Walter noticed something else too. Conversations changed, not dramatically, just enough that you could hear it. If you were listening, less talk about expansion, more talk about holding things together, less talk about what was coming next, more talk about what had to be covered now. And there is a tone that comes into a man's voice when he is no longer talking about getting ahead, but about not falling behind. And that tone started to show up more often than it used to. Walter still kept his routine the same. He worked when there was work to be done, fixed what needed fixing, and left the rest alone. And while others were pushing to regain ground, he wasn't trying to regain anything. He hadn't lost position in the same way, because he had never pushed out as far as they had. And that difference started to matter, not in a loud way, not in something you could point on a single day, but in how each man carried his work through the season. As it went on, there was a point late that year when the numbers stopped being a projection and became something real. Payments came due, whether the crop had lined up or not. And that is where things tightened the most, not in the field, but after it, when the work was done and the results were counted. And Walter could see it in the way people moved after. Then not just in how they worked, but in how they stood, how they spoke, how quickly they finished a conversation, because there was always something else waiting on them now, something that didn't wait for a better day or a better price. Henry came into the co-op one morning and stood by the counter longer than he used to, not saying much, just listening. And when he did speak, it was about parts availability and timing, not about plans, not about next year, just about getting through the next stretch, and everything else one step at a time. and for the first time in a while the gap between him and the others didn't feel quite the same. It wasn't that he had caught up not in speed, not in output, but in something else, something harder to measure, something that had been building quietly over the years and was now starting to show itself as things stopped going according to plan. And that was the year when, if you looked close enough, you could see it, the road hadn't changed, the fields hadn't changed, but the direction things were moving had, and most people didn't call it, yet they still thought it might turn back the other way, that things would line up again the way they had before, and maybe they would for a time. But for those carrying more than they could set down, when needed, it didn't take a full collapse to change everything. It just took enough pressure for long enough. And by the end of that fourth year, that pressure was no longer something you could ignore. It had settled in, and it was not. Leaving quickly, and for Walter Hale, standing in his barn, looking over the same equipment he had been running all along, the difference between where he stood and where the others stood was no longer just a matter of pace. It was a matter of weight and how much of it each man could carry into whatever came next. By the fifth year, nobody talked about getting ahead anymore. They talked about getting through, and that change didn't come with a loud moment. It just settled in one season after another until it was the only way anyone knew how to speak about it. Prices didn't crash overnight. They just stayed low long enough to matter. Costs didn't explode. They just kept rising a little at a time until the numbers that once worked no longer lined up the way they needed to. And when that happens, the difference between carrying something and being carried by it becomes clear. Henry was the first to feel it fully, not because he worked less or cared less, but because there was no more room left to absorb what the year gave him. The combine still ran strong, the field still produced, but the margin that had once made everything possible was gone. And without that margin, every delay, every repair, every shortfall landed harder than it should have. There came a point where he stopped talking about next season entirely and focused only on finishing the one he was in, and even that started to feel like holding on to something that was slipping through his hands. He sold a few pieces, first things he thought he could do, without small steps that didn't look like much from the outside, but meant more than anyone said out loud. Because once you start letting things go, it is rarely the last time. The Miller brothers held on longer. They always had more ground, more output, more to work with, and for a while that kept them steady. They tightened everything further, cut what they could, stretch what they had. But the same pressure was there, and it didn't ease. It stayed right where it was season after season until it worked its way into everything they did. They didn't slow down. They couldn't. But the harder they pushed, the less it seemed to give back. And that is a hard place for any man to stand in when effort no longer leads where it used to. Walter saw it the same way he had seen everything else, not with judgment, not with satisfaction, just with the understanding that comes from watching something long enough to know where it leads. His own seasons were not easy. He didn't suddenly have better luck or easier days. There were still repairs, still delays, still times when things didn't go his way, but those moments didn't stack the same way because there was nothing behind them waiting to turn a bad day into something worse. He worked through them the way he always had, one at a time, and when the season ended, it ended clean, no numbers following him into the next one that he couldn't manage. And that difference, small as it seemed to the start, had grown into something that separated him clearly from the others, not in how they farmed, but in what their farming required of them. By the time the fifth year closed, the decisions that had been made years earlier were no longer abstract. They had taken shape. Henry missed 2 payments before the bank stepped in, not harsh, not sudden, just the way it happens when things have gone on long enough. Without turning back, he didn't argue much. From what Walter heard, there wasn't anything left to argue. He had done what he could. The land went up for auction in the spring. The machine in the yard stayed a little longer, but everyone knew it would follow. The Miller brothers made it through that year, but not the one after. They sold off parts of their operation piece by piece, trying to keep the rest intact. But when everything is tied together, losing one part weakens the whole, and eventually they stepped away from it too, not all at once, just enough each time until there was nothing left that looked like what they had built. And that is how it came back to that morning in the gravel yard, the combine, sitting there clean enough to remind everyone what it once meant, and the price climbing slower than anyone would have expected, because the story attached to it was no longer about progress. It was about what happens when progress costs more than it returns. Walter stood there watching, not because he needed anything from that sale, but because he understood that moment in a way most people didn't. It wasn't about the machine. It was about everything that had come with it, everything that had been believed about what it would do and what It had actually done. The gavel fell, the number settled. And just like that, it was over years of work, decisions made with confidence, long days and longer nights, all reduced to a single transaction that didn't carry any of that weight with it. The machine would go somewhere else. It would keep running. It always does. But it would not carry the story. It came from Henry. Stood there a second longer before turning away, walking toward the house without looking back, and Walter watched him go, knowing there was nothing to say that would change any of it, because this was never about one man making a wrong choice. It was about a direction, a set of decisions that made sense at the time and held together just long enough to feel right before they didn't. Walter turned in and walked back toward his truck, same steady pace he had always kept, not rushed, not slow, just even way he had moved through every season. Behind him, the auction moved on to the next piece of equipment, another number, another story. But for him, that part was already finished. He reached the door of his truck and paused for a moment, looking out over the fields beyond the yard, the same ground he had worked year after year, through good seasons and hard ones, through times when he felt behind and times when it didn't seem to matter. And what he saw now was not victory, the way some people think of it, no celebration, no sense of having beaten anyone else. What he saw was something simpler. He still had his land. He still had his equipment. He still had the ability to step into the next season without something already waiting to take it from him. And that was enough, more than enough, in a world where things do not always turn in your favor. He climbed into the truck, closed the door, and sat there for a second, hands resting on the wheel before starting the engine, not in a hurry, not needing to be anywhere else right away, because for the first time in a long while there was no pressure to move faster than the day required. And as he pulled away from the yard, leaving the auction behind, the difference between him and the others was clear in a way that didn't need explaining. They had chased what might work if everything held together. He had chosen what would still be there when it didn't, and out on that same road where it had all started years before. The fields stretched out the same as they always had, quiet, steady, waiting for another season. And Walter Hale was still there, ready to meet it on his own terms. And for a man like him, that was what success looked like. Not more, not bigger, just lasting long enough to keep going when others could not.